as a real estate agent, you really are about as boots on the ground as you can get. You're working with every price point. You're working all over the city. You're looking at all kinds of neighborhoods. And you're also working with many people of different socioeconomic circumstances. You really do kind of get a very broad perspective.
Welcome back to the Business of Homes podcast. I'm your host, Michael Conrad. Thank you guys again for being here. I'm so fortunate that I get to bring really great stories of the business side of real estate to you. Today, I have the very first realtor that I ever knew in Middle Tennessee, Anna Altic. She is an old friend of mine, and we're actually neighbors, believe it or not, as fate would have it. And she was one of the very first people that I learned little bits about real estate from. And so I'm really thankful that you're able to be here today. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Michael. I'm excited to be here too.
I feel like you hold this outsized sort of guru place in my mind because you've been practicing real estate for a number of years and have occupied a wide variety of positions, gathering all this amazing experience. But the thing I think I probably associate you most with is just the amazing way that you connect into the overall fabric of our city and our neighborhood. I feel like you are a paragon of someone who knows all the inner workings from the highest sort of governmental oriented view all the way down to like where the best restaurants and the best places to go are. And so where did this come from, this sort of impetus to become so connected into this city fabric? Because it may be natural for you as a real estate agent, but you probably didn't start there.
No, that's actually a really good question. I would say, as you were kind of bringing up that discussion, that when I moved to East Nashville, which was 2002, it was a while ago.
Wild West.
Yes, that was when the high-speed chases were still happening at the Shelby Golf Course. What I learned becoming a member of the East Nashville community was what it is to have neighbors and to have grassroots efforts, kind of really parlay into growth and improvement. And so moving into East Nashville and it just being normal to kind of know your neighbors and to look out for each other, and to be parts of groups that would go and clean out alleys, and we'd go clean the playground so our kids didn't, have to touch needles. Like we were kind of back in the heyday, really. It was the Wild West over here, you know. But what that really taught me was that when people kind of get together and they gather and they put good ideas into place and they follow that with good actions, that you end up with the kind of neighborhood that we have today.
Strong social fabric.
Correct. And so I think that was really sort of what got me started. And then very much in real estate, because very shortly after moving into East Nashville, I just fell in love with the process of buying a house. And so for me, it was also, within real estate, you can, as a business model and a business plan, you can be a socially conscious real estate agent that really focus as much on making the community better as you do on making a living, and that those both things can coexist.
Yeah, that's a really interesting level up than I think the conversation usually is. Real estate has a very communal feel because you have to work the personal sphere of yours, and that's everybody's different. But what are we thinking about when we're placing a buyer in said neighborhood in Franklin, or if we're hearing them say, oh, I want to live in a condo in the Gulch? Are we thinking about Franklin as a neighborhood, as a place, or is it really just a zip code? What are we thinking about and doing for that fabric of the community, and how are we involving ourselves there in those places?
For sure. I think that's, and kind of introducing them into that community as well as a part of your sales process of, here's your city council person, here's your elected officials, your school board person, and just sort of encouraging them to also become an engaged member of their community.
Does this create certain limitations by where you are investing your time? If you're someone who lives in East Nashville, does it mean that you can't really be super successful at selling Franklin because you don't know that area as well? You don't live there?
No, not at all. I mean, to be very honest, my current office is out of Green Hills. So
Oh, there you go.
there's no real limitation. I think it is for me about being a realtor is really understanding the different communities, understanding the needs of the people that are in those communities. Now, to be totally fair, I sell in Franklin. I can't say that that's a big piece of the advocacy work that I do because I'm a little bit more focused on, say, affordable housing, and I like to use the word attainable housing.
Attainable housing.
Attainable housing. And so, really, I'm kind of looking at it from the lens of how are we sort of building communities and thinking in terms of building communities where really access, and that's when I talk about attainable housing, that access is there for any person that wants to live there.
So it strikes me, is there a piece of real estate that I'm not fully aware of that is almost conservation in the way that we want to, say, mine the minerals out of the ground in a responsible way for our ecosystem? Do we also want to sell houses in a responsible way where we have the chance to sell houses again in the future because we are helping build strong networked in communities? We're helping revitalize areas that have gone to pot, or, we're making sure that attainable housing is present across the spectrum. Like, is that the idea? Is there a conservation component to being a realtor?
I think it's more of a preservation component. So, and I use that word because I think of when I look at preserving a quality of life, and that can look very different for many people, and it can also look very different for the phase of life that you're in. If you're a first-time buyer, or if you're younger and you don't have a family, or if you're an empty nester, like that phase of life and not preserving that quality of life and what that looks like can be very different. But if you don't have housing inventory to sort of seat all of those needs, then you're really missing. What you're doing is really impacting people's A, quality of life, B, ability to sort of attain generational wealth. But I also sort of look at it in terms of when we talk about preserving, our city, the fabric of our city. To me, it's great that we're in its city, but it was that really there was a little something for everybody here. And I really hope that we find our way back and continue to sort of focus on that. And the benefit of that is, first of all, we need to have inventory that the average first-time home buyer, right, can buy into. And right now, when your median home price is $400,000, that means 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the average first-time home buyer was 28, and right now NAR says they're 36. So that process is losing 8 years of building equity, of building generational wealth, because we're not creating inventory that really would allow people to kind of start on that homeownership journey.
That's a really intense when you put an actual number to it. Once upon a time, many moons ago, I was from California, where I didn't know a number, but I knew in my heart that no one bought a home before they were 45 or 50. That just was like culturally not a thing back in like the 90s and the 2000s. And so when I came to Tennessee during the recession, I realized, oh, wait, people of all walks of life, singles, marrieds, families, people who work for nonprofits, people who are executives, everyone can buy a house because there's a house for everyone. At least there was at that point. And so it's a really interesting and sort of harrowing reality to say the average buyer is not getting in, and those numbers are climbing and are looking more like our coastal and sort of urban brothers out there across America.
Yeah.
That's intense. So revitalizing a neighborhood, that seems really important and straightforward. But what happens when so many of those neighborhoods have been revitalized? I mean, you and I have both been in business enough that we've seen 12 South go from a really hard neighborhood to amazing. East Nashville go from a hard neighborhood to amazing. And even traditional areas like Bordeaux and Buena Vista that have been more difficult longer are really becoming amazingly revitalized in recent history. What do we do when we've revitalized all of our urban core?
Well, and then again, the trickier part of it is, and I don't, and there's not one size fits all. And I don't look at builders and say builders are the issue. And I don't look at city government and say city government's the issue. I think it's a holistic approach that has to happen. But when, and you know, we can talk about this because we were hit by the tornado.
Right.
And I was a little more impacted than you were, but you know, the homes that were next to me that were single family ranch style homes that were $200,000 to $300,000 houses, those lots were bought up after the tornado, and those are now $500,000 or $600,000, $900,000 houses.
Right.
And on the outside of that, that looks like a great thing. I mean, it's great for me and my property value.
Right.
And I get it. But, you know, that also raises the tax burden for people that have lived in that neighborhood for 40 or 50 years because now their lot values have doubled. And so that can create some hardship. But you go past that and you're like, well, within our improving of these projects, what we've approved is not adding more approachable inventory to the market. We're actually adding more luxury inventory to the market.
And for the record, to anyone listening here, this is not just some sort of fictitious poor person that can't afford these changes in the market. This is regular people like you and I
that are teachers.
Yeah, like we can't sell our house because we can't rebuy in the same neighborhood, you know, because, you know, the prices have doubled, you know, kind of a thing. And so the neighborhood demographics are changing and, you know, it looks different. It feels different. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it doesn't feel as good.
Yeah, I think so. And I think my concern is that we're going to luxury our way out of a healthy market. And we continue to have a very resilient real estate market in Nashville specifically. I think actually NAR, because you know me and I like my numbers, NAR's actually had the top 7 pent-up buyer demand markups.
Pent-up buyer demand. I saw those.
And Nashville is on that list.
Yeah.
And
for anyone who doesn't know what that means, that basically means that there's a lot of buyers sitting on the sidelines because the money is expensive to borrow and the inventory is poor. And so they're feeling like they're going to have to really scrap for it. They just got burned a couple years ago by a glowing red hot market where everything was going above list and crazy numbers. And so there's a lot of people waiting for a more equilibrium-based paradigm to sort of enter back into the situation so that they can jump into the market. And when they do, it's actually just going to cause all of that frenzy all over again.
Yeah. And so for me, thinking about that, you think, all right, I come from the hospitality industry, and that is the second largest, I believe, employer in Nashville.
Oh, yeah.
I think behind healthcare. And I think publishing is kind of up there as well. But you realize those bartenders, those wait staff, those housekeepers, all of that, they have to have a place to live in order for this economy that we're enjoying to really function and focus. And then you take a step back past that and you'd say it used to be, and it may still be, but a big chunk of our colleges, because we're college town as well. We've got Vanderbilt, and we've got all of that a huge chunk of the kids that stayed here or that went to school here stayed here because it was affordable. The ancillary costs like childcare and taxes and all that stuff were really favorable. So for you to sort of get started, it was a great space or a city or market really to kind of really get started in. And so when I look at, I've got a 24-year-old son who's in Chattanooga, and he's looking at coming back to Nashville with a college degree and saying it's too cost prohibitive.
Oof. Yeah. Because if you're sending your youthful, next generation out into the world and they can't return or they don't want to stay because these costs, then there's sort of a brain drain. There's a cultural drain. There's, a lot of negative sort of outflowing.
Sure. So then you think about things like the Alliance Bernsteins and the, these big corporations that we're attracting. And it's like, well, where's the talent pool going to come from if they can't afford to buy here?
Yeah.
If that dollar isn't going to go as far as it used to. And so I think those are the conversations. I do feel like even this current administration, those are the conversations that are trying to be had. But if I had any kind of educational piece for real estate agents, but then also the public, is when we talk about attainable housing, we're not talking about subsidized housing per se. We're talking about creating options and inventory that allow for buy-in and allow for people to have a quality of life that are hardworking, normal middle-class Americans.
Yeah. I've heard stories about metropolitan areas providing favorable, almost like a land grant of sorts to developers to create affordable, attainable housing. But is that the subsidy that we want to try to avoid because it's a little too falsely propped up? Or is that still a good idea?
You know, I think it's going to be a whole lot of things. So there really could be, there used to be the TIF, the tax incremental financing. So there were some tax benefits that you could get. There was certainly some land grants. I know right now, supposedly Metro owns almost the most land.
Oh, funny.
In the city. And so where is all that land and what's it being used for? You know, and I don't know that exact factually, but I do know they own a whole heck of a lot of parcels of land.
Yeah.
And when you think of abandoned schools and you think of, you know, all of these things, but
interesting.
The broader question is, all right, well, where do we intersect policy with also incentives? And so some of that policy could be downzoning, right? It could be updating our zoning code so that when you're thinking in terms of density, that you say, hey, in these certain spots, it's not going to disrupt a neighborhood and maybe we can invite a little bit more density. But if we're going to do that, we're going to give you this price on this land, then this is the product that you need to deliver to the market. This is the price point that it needs to be in. And this needs to be the consumer that we're targeting. And so those are, I think, some other other conversations that need to start happening.
This is such an interesting thing. I want everyone who's listening to rewind and catch some of these again, because we're kind of deep in the rabbit hole here. And I would say that the average real estate agent isn't thinking a ton about policy changes that are going to affect their profession. But in the reality, I think you said it best before we even got started, that the realtor is one of the last great defenders and connectors of all of these parts and pieces of like city fabric and like social policy and governance that's happening at the political levels. Combine that with regular folks buying regular homes and regular pieces of land in your city. And so it's not just enough for us to be slinging contracts, even though in these sort of up and down roller coaster markets, sometimes that's all we can focus on because it feels like, oh man, I just got to get to my next listing or I got to get to my next buyer. Things are hard, but we have to be conscious about, you know, what are we doing to achieve those goals? And you know, are we being responsible in our listings, you know, around price value, you know, and land value?
All of that, sure. And then also, I think beyond, you know, I'm not a big fan of the TV shows out in LA with the really catty, you know, characters.
The HGTV stuff.
Well, all of that, but they all sort of sell this concept of what a realtor does. And I think it's really gotten us in trouble.
Oof.
To be very honest, because it does just look like we drive fancy cars and drink champagne and you know, show mansions all day and take pictures of ourselves in a penthouse bathtub. Like that's what they perceive that we're doing.
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
I know, but when you talk about, like, for example, these lawsuits with National Association of Realtors and all of the stuff, it's because they have a perception of what we do that is not accurate. And, you know, I think the average real estate agent, the good ones, I mean, and there's some bad ones, but most of the ones I run into are good. You know, we're actually crawling in crawl spaces sometimes. And we are engaging at community meetings and answering questions about a development. We're out again, we're advocating on our local association. We're advocating on the state level. But there's so much more that to me to being a real estate agent, being a realtor, and to really kind of leave the housing market as good or better than we found it. You know?
Man, what a call to arms that is. I really appreciate that. Please, if you are in real estate, be someone who goes to community meetings. Be someone who reads the bills of what's being legislated in your area. Be someone who knows how to answer those questions for your regular folks, friends, and neighbors. Just in the same way that we all call that friend who knows about computers or knows about construction, to have them interpret these normal things in our life that we don't understand. There's so much about real estate and policy and city fabric and zoning that most of us, heck, I don't understand a lot of that stuff. And it's so helpful to have a qualified real estate professional. And I really mean that, qualified real estate professional. You've got to be more than just an Instagrammer driving a nice car in a fancy bathtub or whatever you were saying. And so that is a great call to arms, that the education you're looking for is not just enough to keep your license active. It's to round you out in your understanding of where you fit in the grand scheme of things. You're right. There is a larger social conversation going on about the value of a real estate agent and like, what do they do and what do they bring? And I feel like this is a big piece you can grab onto and say, if you understand this stuff, you can bring immense value to your community, whether that's your street, your friend group, or your city.
Yeah. Well, and I can even sort of give you an example of having worked, with Greater Nashville Realtors and on their board. And we've got now what's called the Government Affairs and Policy GAP Committee. And we just reworked that committee. But understand, some of the policy work that we've done is we actually interviewed every candidate for mayor, at least the top 10 candidates.
Amazing.
We did over 40 interviews with potential city council members. I can say right now, four city council members, it may be 5, are actually practicing realtors.
I did know that.
And they're not there just to be pro-developer. They're pro-housing. And, we're not always on the same page with them, but, you do get a seat at the table and a piece of the conversation, right? And so this newer incarnation of this GAP committee is that we really do say, take zoning policy, which came up last week. Now we put that on the back burner of saying, all right, well, we're going to take a committee and we're going to interview stakeholders. We're going to go to the community meetings. We're going to interview stakeholders like builders and construction workers. We're going to talk with the national home builders. And we're going to also talk with those sponsoring members of that bill. And we're going to try to make recommendations that sort of are as much win-wins as we can get out of it. But we're going to talk to that issue as a stakeholder, as a real estate agent that is boots on the ground and sees the impacts of some of these decisions that are made.
Yeah.
And so that, it's just it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's kind of an interesting part of the piece of the puzzle. And again, it's just yet another value that we can bring to the table because again, as a real estate agent, you really are, you are about as boots on the ground as you can get. You're working with every price point. You're working all over the city. You're looking at all kinds of neighborhoods. And you're also working with many people of different socioeconomic circumstances. And you really do kind of get a very broad perspective and a very rounded perspective that can be of value. And so it's nice when you start to have these relationships with your city council members, for example, because then they do call you and they'll go, I'm thinking about this bill. What do you think? And what are the ins and outs? What are the unintended consequences? And those sort of become really productive conversations that you then see turn into good policy.
Hey everyone, it's Jake, Director for the Business of Homes podcast. I hope you've been enjoying today's episode, starting with the importance of understanding your community, the preservation component of real estate, and what's needed to create obtainable housing. When we return, Micheal and Anna dive into community involvement as a lead generation opportunity, trends toward long-term sellable homes, and chickens. Trust me, it has to do with real estate. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Business of Homes Pod, where you can interact with us and see some great bite-sized pieces from all of our episodes. For you listeners out there, did you know our entire podcast are filmed and are on our YouTube channel? Check it out next time you want to see our amazing guests tell their stories. And are you currently watching this episode in video format? Don't forget to follow us on your preferred audio streaming service to take us with you on the go. Lastly, do you have any feedback or want to suggest someone for the show? Email us at thebusinessofhomespodcast@gmail.com. Please enjoy the rest of today's episode with Anna Altic. Let's get back to it.
The conversation in realtors with less experience than, say, 3 years is oftentimes directed to, what do I need to do to be generating more leads or be more involved, or like, how do I get people to notice me more? And undeniably, one of the big ways that you do that is going deep in an individual community. We all are going to be people that are working all over the metro. So we don't need to say that, oh, I go anywhere, I do everything. Sure. Focus in. We've talked about on this podcast and at other coaching events that like focusing in on a neighborhood or a piece of the larger metro is an incredibly beneficial way to grow your sphere and to grow your business.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no more quantifiable way to do that than to get to know those stakeholders, those other folks that are involved in those communities. And that's going to be elected officials and other types of people that are having these conversations about, this neighborhood or that neighborhood or whatever it is. And this is particularly important, I think, within Davidson, where you have a lot of strong old neighborhood identities.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're wanting to capture a niche or a neighborhood, this is how you do it. Maybe in a more outlying area, it's HOAs and sort of sectioned off neighborhoods. But in the city fabric, it's defined by these sort of old community lines. And so this is a really good gold nugget that people can hold on to and say, okay, this is what I can do. If I don't know what I need to be doing, this is what I can do. I can go meet people, because then you're going to meet, like you said, all walks of life. And they're going to be able to look to you and say, that's someone who's interested in advocating for me.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of a way that it happens sometimes is that person looks like me and feels like me, so I'll do business with them. We don't want to necessarily do business who just look like us, but we know, like, and trust, right? And so that trust is going to come from that community involvement.
Absolutely. I can, I can talk about some lead gen, unintentional lead gen, or intentional, if you want to say.
Right.
But one of the first things that I helped do in East Nashville was help get a little community garden put into the Laughlin Elementary School, and I learned how to write a grant and wrote a grant and got a little bit of money, and we got the community support and worked with the school and got that put in. But I would say 3 to 4 transactions directly came from just that little bit of help that I did. But there were people that had volunteered with me that ended up realizing I was a real estate agent, and they later contacted me to sell. And then, I even, at one point, this is where I always talk about community involvement, was helping coach cross country, but it was volunteer, and I'm not the best runner, but like I can coach 5 and 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds, right? And I can coach them to get better and be better. So meeting at Shelby Park 3 times a week and working with these young kids. And then that ended up being, I can't think of a time where I haven't got tenfold in return, either in business or in just good outcomes for people.
Yeah.
So yes, I can't say enough about community involvement, but I would also challenge people to not think so much, and even in terms of it could be a neighborhood, and that would be a great thing. But it also could be, advocacy for first-time home buyers. It could be advocacy for minority home buyers. It could be transit. That's a big hot button, a buzzword here. So if you're somebody that comes from a city or an area, or you're just interested in transit, that's a big conversation. There are so many community meetings. There are so many opportunities for you to engage and then become the transit person and, talk about transit-oriented development and that kind of thing. So you have, it doesn't necessarily even have to be a geographic neighborhood. It can be a specific kind of advocacy arena that you could dive into as well.
Real estate training and schooling teaches you to be a non-specifically skilled individual. And we continue to return in these different stories we're telling here on this podcast to practitioners like yourself, brokers like yourself, who are encouraging people to go become skilled, go become knowledgeable in these different areas. And I think this becomes sort of this underlying thread that the best real estate agents with the most sustainable business models and the best longevity over time are those that have taken up certain niches or skill sets and have made them their own. Yes, sure, they are practicing realtors, but they are community organizers or they're specialists in these sorts of different ways. And that's a really great reminder, because I think you're the best possible real estate agent when you're focused on something else and the work is just coming to you. It's very indirect. It's coming to you because of the work that you're focused on. I like that. I like that a lot.
Well, and the way that we met was greenhousing, green building.
That's right.
And that was something I got very excited about, and still am very excited about green building. I think we were about 10 years a little ahead on the market, a little early, but I know it's going to come back. I'm ready for it, and I'm here for it. I think smart home technology is going to be the kind of predecessor to green homes, but they're actually saying older buyers are worried about sustainability. So empty nesters, that is kind of a newer trend of smart homes, and sustainability is something that they care about as well. I don't know if it's maybe a long-term legacy in terms of how I leave the planet for my grandkids. I don't know, but they're thinking about that now. But again, there were opportunities. I worked with our multiple listing service and got all of those green features that are currently in our multiple listing service. I worked with them and got those added. And so, gosh, did that make me more money? Maybe. But I'm pretty excited. I mean, it was neat when we became a toolbox for the National Association of Realtors as being one of the most green MLSs in the country. And that was like right in the middle of the worst part of the market. That was 2009, 2010 that we were doing that.
It's so interesting. If we're not careful, we're going to sell ourselves into a corner, like paint yourself into a corner. And we have to be conscious of those more sustainable oriented things, whether it's, city fabric around transit or whether it's green features, to ensure that we have homes that are attainable and sellable long term. I see a big trend towards tinier homes. There's a big tiny home, shipping container home sort of, thing that's a wave that's coming. There is more development on those sort of green features happening than ever before, but it takes an orientation beyond the dollar to do those things. It doesn't mean you can't make money. In fact, money can be made, but you have to have money be maybe second or third on the list. And sometimes the other folks around us in the grander real estate thing, financiers, developers, builders, they're not always quick to leap to let's put money lower on the list. And so I think that in a lot of ways, that's a place of advocacy that realtors can participate in too, of being the bridge between the public and the world of financing and development, that we need those things so that there are more homes. We need more homes in which for people to buy.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's going to drive prices down a lot, but at the very least, we've had a long-term supply problem. And so if we can get more of them, whether they're tinier or they're easier to build or something like that, but the cheap products and the fast production build isn't the way. I think we've established that over the last 15, 20 years. And so it's good to think about different types of advocacy to make sure that we're able to continue having a business in 5 or 15 years from now.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think of an example of what you were talking about kind of in terms of sustainability and policy and also that kind of confluence of policy. And I can't say it enough. So for example, there are a ton of builders that are out there that are like, gosh, if I could get this project approved, I would do it, right? If I could get codes to approve this,
yes,
I would do it. And I think that's sometimes where there is this, who's having those conversations up? Because that was one of the questions that I had asked the current mayor, and I'm not on a first name basis with him, and I don't want to act like I'm super familiar or anything like that. But one of the questions that I said is, look, there are so many alternative building options out there. If it's prefab homes or if it's 3D printing or if it's, as you say, container homes, or there's so many options that are out there. And when you've got building codes that are 70, 80 years old, or you've just got kind of, your basic infrastructure in your city and the way that you run these departments are not open to these different
forward leaning. Right.
Or there's not really a mechanism for them to be forward leaning because of the way our charter works or our city policy works. And that's when you start to have these great conversations of like, okay, we need better, more inventory. How do we get more inventory here? Builders can make money. Realtors can make money. People start to build that generational wealth. But what does that look like?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's where I say, subsidizing is just a piece of it, but it's just a tiny piece of it. It doesn't have to be about taxpayer money or anything like that. It really can just be smart policy and good planning. and about getting then good community engagement where you're actually giving accurate information out to people, because there's a lot of that misconception out there too. That the not in my backyard kind of misconception. And you understand it because the information out there that's being put out sometimes is just, it's not even, they're not intentionally trying to mislead. It's just fear-based. And when you really show the facts, sometimes, and I always tell this funny story. So, yet another thing a little realtor did, but probably about 10 or 11 years ago, there was this big push to allow people to have chickens.
Oh, I remember.
Do you remember the chickens?
I do.
The big chicken argument. And so there was just all of this neighborhood blasting, this is going to ruin values, and particularly on the west side of town. And I understand they're used to a quality of life over there, and those are very established communities, but they're like, if somebody's going to have 40 chickens and it's going to ruin my property values and do all this stuff. And so I know it's the chickens are going to ruin Nashville. I mean, it was like that. It was intense.
Oh, I wrote an op-ed in the Tennessean about it.
Well, so I wrote a blog, and I don't know if you remember this, but basically I just took the top 5 real estate markets, and I took the top highest performing from Forbes and the lowest 5 for performing markets. And I said, all right, well, do they have chicken ordinances? So I pulled all of their permits and their codes and their records. And, at that time it was Chicago, and of the top, all these different cities, and they're Indianapolis and all these places. And so I pulled the top 5, and it realized the only of the top 5 markets in the nation at that time, the only place that didn't have a chicken ordinance was Nashville. And I looked at the top 5 least performing markets in the country, and every single one of them didn't have a chicken ordinance. Every single one of them didn't have chickens. And so I wrote this, the Tennessean picks it up, and then lo and behold, I get invited to city council to kind of just explain my findings. And ultimately it was, all right, the fear is that your property values are going to be impacted and that this is going to, ruin this. You can have chickens in Chicago.
Amazing.
By the way, you can actually, at the time, you could have a rooster. I still don't know if you could have a rooster. You can't have roosters here. But, really just to come in and say, here's the real facts of it. I can get the fear about this, that you might have diseases and smells and all this. But the reality is that this has been long established in other real estate markets, and it didn't impact them. If anything, it's helped them. And so ultimately that passed. I can't say I was the person that got that passed. But for me, it is about kind of coming to the table with that sort of level of information and then allowing people to sort of at least make, if they're a voting member or if they're, a city leader or whatever, that they're at least coming at it from an informed perspective.
I think that's where a lot of people don't realize the brokenness of our current governance system, whether it's a local level or national level, is that the parties who are legislating and making decisions are just on the whole very uninformed. And it's a flow of information problem. We do live in an information age, but the bottleneck of information is just so terrible. And so who is informing them? How are these people being informed? And is it actually benefiting the right parties? And so again, we'll go back to this idea that who better to advocate for houses, for cities, for fabrics of neighborhoods, for the people buying and selling these houses than a real estate professional whose skills lay very well in what do people want? What do people need? Where do they want to live? Like, what are they wanting? I mean, this feels such like a perfect fit that I'm sorry that more people aren't involved at this level, because it feels like such an obvious place to be involved with so many benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agreed. And especially as a real estate agent, I really think advocacy should be a big piece of who you try to become as you're working, as becoming, as I said, a community advocate, a neighborhood advocate. I again, could be a transit advocate. There's no limit, but I think aspiring to, as I've always said, leave the business a little better than you found it is a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's just this continual charge that we're challenging people with here, and that is go deep, don't fear the technical. Real estate professionals aren't just salespeople. There's so much more to it. Don't fear the deeper areas of real estate, whether it's commercial or governance or whatever it is. Like, it's worth going down the rabbit trails to learn these things and own these things and understand these things. You don't have to practice at the deepest level. You can still just be someone who has that library of information in the back of your mind, and you access it every once in a while, or you work with someone else who knows more. But it's beneficial to all of us when we are sort of looking up a little bit more than the down we look at so often in our business.
Well, and at the core of what we do and the core of our value, and I know you're going to probably hear a lot about realtors in this next year, again, because of these lawsuits. What is our value? What is our value? And you know, at the core of it for me, the conversation is that we are advocates. That's naturally what we do. When we come into a transaction, that's not the sexy stuff they show on TV, but what we are doing when we're effective is getting people on the same page. And a lot of the time, they're in a very emotional space, you know, between a buyer and a seller, if it's a divorce circumstance, if it's a, you know, family death, if it's a life transition or whatever it is. But we do a tremendous job oftentimes of being able to get people onto the same page and in moving in a direction that they want to be moving in.
Yeah.
And that's a core piece of what we do. The other core piece that we do is we are disseminators of accurate information. You know, we do have a code of ethics about how we put things in the multiple listing service, how we input closings and sold closings, and how we input our days on market and all of this stuff that appraisers use that would affect the economy if we weren't being accurate.
Yeah, there's a general feeling amongst regular folk about how things are going, and I'm not sure exactly how accurate it is all the time.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the general value is, so when people say your value, it's like, gosh, I care. You are hiring me to care more about your outcome than my own.
Yeah.
That is a key piece of what, that is not even in the code of ethics. That's the Tennessee law that says you will put the interest of your client above your own.
Well, I can't speak to NAR. It's a pretty big spectrum for me to even take in, but I can definitely speak to the local level and the importance of the associations and the involvement they have in local governance. And so here's your friendly neighborhood plug to be more involved than just a dues paying member to your association, but know what they are advocating for. You know, go to those meetings, ask your friends what they know. I mean, it's going to affect your practice as you go. If you're relatively new in real estate, you're going to become more experienced and you're going to wish that you were more knowledgeable earlier. And so, how have you been involved in that sort of association and governance side of it? And how can other people get more involved?
Sure. So, and a lot of people just don't understand how our association or these associations are structured. But essentially what we have is you've got a staff of people that work at any of these. It could be MTAR, Middle Tennessee Association of Realtors, Greater Nashville, WCAR, Williamson County. So you've got a portion of paid staff that work there that are just really working to kind of do the mission and overall goals of that local association. Greater Nashville Realtors has got nearly 7,000 members. They have not had a lot of slippage. They might be 6,700. But within that, then they're basically governed by a board of directors that's elected. And historically, a few hundred agents elect out of the 6,000 or 7,000 members.
Wow.
That really, sort of engage in that and vote. And so you've got a board of, as I said, you've got a board of directors, and they're essentially meeting every month, and they're kind of discussing all of the things that are the different committees that are doing. So under that board of directors, you've got these different committees. You've got RPAC, which is the fundraising for the arm of and by the way, when people talk about RPAC, I don't want to give money to RPAC because I don't want to give money to the state. I don't like what the state's bills are doing, or I don't want to give money because that money goes to some senator who was involved in January 6th. Like, I've heard it all and I get it.
Interesting.
But 80 to 90% of what you give to RPAC comes back into Nashville. And that comes back into our association then really engaging on the local level with our city council members and making, we don't tend to do endorsements, but we'll fund, we'll give funds towards certain elections. And so it goes through that process of us doing that due diligence. For example, when you're talking about 40, 50 interviews, that was over the course of probably 4 hours, 5 hours a day, 5-6 days. Like it was, lengthy. So getting into these different committees, I got off on a tangent on RPAC, but they've got, Habitat for Humanity and Greater Nashville Realtors funds and builds one habitat house a year. They've got education. So they've got some pencil schools that they partner with, but then they kind of look at education policy. And then you've got the GAP, Government Affairs and Policy Committee. So there's all of these committees, and you can volunteer to serve on these committees. And then those committees report to the board and they say, here's what our committee is working on. And here's what we think the board should do.
Yeah, all this work is more than one person has to give and can feel very overwhelming when you're trying to run your business and farm your sphere and like do your business and practice. And so being fractionally involved at the association level is a way to not get overwhelmed by all the many things that you could and probably should be involved in. You can sort of choose a little bit, and in doing so, we can collectively work towards these larger goals because I don't have to work on all of them by myself, kind of a thing. And so that's a good reminder that the association's not there just to take your dues and throw you a party a couple times a year. It's there to do some of the work that, quite frankly, we just regular practitioners, we just don't have time for, And so, make sure you're involved and, make sure the people around you are involved.
And what's beautiful about it, what's really cool about it is an unintended consequence for me in getting engaged. So eventually I ran for the board and it took a few tries, but got on the board and then have, again, chaired several of the committees. I want to clarify, for committee work, 3 to 5 hours a month at most. It's not a big time commitment at all. And you learn a ton, and you also really start to engage with your fellow realtors. And when you're in that multiple offer situation and you've got a rapport already, it really helps, and you've worked together on projects and stuff, it really helps. But beyond that, within the process of, say, serving on the board, we did a strategic planning session. And so I kind of know how to write mission and vision statements now. Yeah. And so I've had some other nonprofits approach me and say, this would be something you could really help us with, because now I've done it. Through my work at Greater Nashville Realtors, I got media training. Because they were looking for certain spokespeople to be able to go out and do media training, which is probably why I'm crazily calm here. It's because so it's like anything else where I've said, gosh, the more that I give, it's always surprising how much more you get back in return. And not just in money for sure, or transactions, but industry knowledge for sure, but then also just skill sets, or you kind of stumble into a passion. And so this last 3 to 4 years, that kind of local governance piece of it is just something that's really emerged for me, is just something that wakes me up on a Monday morning, and totally. I really enjoy doing it. And I think I'm good at it. And I think that I'm good at getting, again, as a realtor and in my broker role, you get really good at getting people on the same page and talking people off ledges and having, leaning into some difficult conversations, and being able to be very direct but respectful. And so I think in return, just by being engaged in your level of professionalism and the tools in your toolbox are going to exponentially expand.
Boom, right there. Because the experience you're getting out of transaction to transaction to transaction, it ultimately, it's not the multiplied effect that it appears to be. It's very linear, because yes, everything's always custom and so different in real estate, but there is, generally speaking, a way things always go. And so to deepen your skill set, to deepen your experience by expanding what it is that you're interested in, working on, and skilled and knowledgeable of, is going to have that multiplied effect. So where you are 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line in experience, you're going to be beyond peers at that point who merely were just writing contracts the whole time. And that's a good note for us to sort of leave on and ring in people's ears, that there's a non-linear way towards experience that is usually going to be opening your eyes, looking up from like the grind a little bit, expanding your horizons, and sort of going deep in some of these areas. And this is a really important piece of it, this sort of connection to the overall fabric of both the realtor community and the community at large. And so this has been great, man. Anna, thank you so much for dropping so many great truth bombs for us. And I hope that people will reach out to you and learn from you and what you have to offer and get involved at their association locally. And thanks so much for being here.
Of course. It was fun. I know it probably didn't look like I was having fun, but I'm having fun.
You're doing great. Guys, thank you so much for continuing with us on this journey at the Business of Homes podcast. I hope that if you have some comments or questions, you'll hit us up, find us on social media, or if you want to be on the podcast, let me know. We'll catch you next time.
Hey everyone, Jake again, Director for the Business of Homes podcast. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. A huge thank you to Anna Altic for being a part of the podcast. Please let her know how much you enjoyed their story. Don't forget to subscribe on your preferred listening platform and make sure to follow us on Instagram at The Business of Homes Pod. Do you have any feedback or want to suggest someone for the show? Email us at thebusinessofhomespodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you soon.